Appreciate you being in class tonight. Just a couple of quick explanations. I apologize. The printer ate part of my notes, and I redid it 3 times, and I tried to do front and back unsuccessfully, so Bill Crane accuses me either of wanting to cut down trees or have a share in a paper company, and I apologize that we have an extra sheet of paper on our outline tonight. That wasn't intentional, but I wanted to try to get that ready. If you have Proverbs, we're going to be in chapter 3 here in just a second. I've mentioned this earlier, but this is just something that just stays with me a lot. To me, a large part of wisdom has to do with learning to say kind of the right thing at the right time with the right tone. And oftentimes, and especially when we're dealing with a difficult situation, we just need to be mindful how we say something may be as important to the person that we're speaking to as just what we say. And by this time in our lives, we've all had times that we wished we could push rewind and either restate something or not say something just quite that manner. And I mentioned this with us having 2 girls. We didn't have any major fights over this, but we had these kind of heart-to-heart discussions about what is appropriate to wear. And I told you, and I can do this since the person I live with isn't here because she still doesn't like this. But I told her girls, as I've mentioned, we're Church of Christ preachers' daughters, and somewhere between looking like a nun and going to work on a pole is where we're going to live. We're going to find a middle ground somewhere in here. And so I don't want you to look like a nun, but neither do I want the other alternative. And we're going to find a middle ground somewhere in the middle. Well, if you're 13 years old and your dad's going to talk to you about what you're wearing, how and even when you do that is nearly as important as what the actual conversation is. And so when we look at kind of this continued discussion about wisdom, one of the bottom lines tonight, and for us just to kind of file this away, is that in the book of Proverbs, wisdom, and this is an overstatement. Let me overstate this and then back off a little bit. But oftentimes in Proverbs, wisdom has more to do with our actions and what we say than just what we know. The words understanding, insight, discretion, all of those are very important, but oftentimes wisdom has to do with our activities and our actions and the things that we actually do. And there were a couple of times in talking with new Christians, like for example, I had a conversation with a guy for 5 hours, the last. And the conversation started, and they had been with us for nearly 2 years, and everything seemed to be fine. And he just said, "Can we get together and talk?" And I said, "Yes." And very early he said, "My problem with you guys is that you actually believe the events in the Bible are real." And I'm thinking, well, what else is new? He said, "You actually believe Jesus was raised from the dead?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "And my biggest problem is on Sunday you talked about crossing the Red Sea, and did a little boy stick his finger in the water?" He said, "It was just a little puddle and they wandered across and the chariots got stuck in the mud." And I said, No. So we have this 5-hour conversation, and he had just become convinced that miracles in the Bible, including the resurrection, don't matter. Well, this was our last conversation. But how do you talk to someone like that without just dumping on them and being angry and other stuff? So this wisdom and discretion has an awful lot to do with our actions, but I also want us to think it also has a lot to do, and the word tone is something that's really important with me, that just how we go about it. And you know what I'm saying. This has not happened here, so everybody's exempt. But there's been about 3 or 4 times that I've had someone say, "Brother, in the name of love, I need to tell you something." And I wish they'd just gotten a stick and beat me with it rather than saying, "In the name of love." It was just, they said, "In the name of love," and then they just kind of verbally took this stick out and beat you with it. And when we go through wisdom tonight, and this will continue on, then a part of our continuing prayer in our personal lives, and this has to do with, first of all, our immediate family, and then kind of extended, our church family, but then those are on the outside. Be wise as serpents and what? Harmless as doves, and that opportunity that we have to talk with people is so important. This is an old statement, and I'm sure you've heard this in different ways, but I grew up hearing this term. The Old Testament is the New Testament concealed, and the New Testament is the Old Testament revealed. And so while we're going to come to Proverbs 3 and 4, I wanted to look at these examples in the life of our Lord. And where I want us to start is, remember the concept, the Word became what? Flesh. And then what happens? Oh, He dwells among us. And when you look at, and these are samples. We could do the whole lesson on this, but I just wanted to start with these samples. There's an earlier one in 240, but I just wanted to start with this one tonight. He is 12 years old. And here's the transition statement that takes us to the opening of the ministry. Jesus increased, or He grew, He developed. And the very first thing Luke tells us is, in wisdom. Now, here's what's significant from how I look at this. Son of God? Yes. Sinless? Yes. But He doesn't come into the world as a full-grown adult man. He has this experience of being a child, and to what level does this happen? It wasn't that God just infused Him with wisdom and knowledge and other things. Well, what happens in His life? Like us, He developed, He increased, He grew in wisdom. And that's the very first thing that we find out about the development of our Lord. And then these other terms are important. He grew in stature, and isn't this always interesting? He grew in favor with God. By the time that He's crucified, He has a greater sense of favor with God than He did when He was born. And so all the time we have the sinlessness going on. But what's encouraging for us is that as we have talked about fixing our eyes on Jesus, then we have the example of someone who it wasn't just given to him, it wasn't just poured into his head. I'm sure there were things he had to learn, and even, for example, after we have the incident in Jerusalem, he goes home and he's submissive to his mom and dad. So the boy, from 12 as he develops, he matures and grows. But for us, what's encouraging, and here's this Old Testament concealed and revealed, is that yes, we're going to be looking at a section from wisdom literature, but I wanted to start on this side tonight and look back and say, when we look at these things tonight in Proverbs about growing in wisdom, then this is the same process that happened with our Lord. And let me just say this as optimistically as possible. Hopefully, if you and I are here 5 years or 10 years from now, we have grown and developed in wisdom. Hopefully, some of us less in stature. That would probably be a benefit for me. But the whole idea of in favor with God and man, these were developmental things that were part of our Lord's development. And so, as we go through his teaching, we're going to hear, and I use this term echoes, we're going to hear echoes of wisdom terminology that we're going to see in the book of Proverbs. What did we grow up if we grew up in VBS? The wise men. And see, it's not what he knows, it's not what he feels, what did he do? The wise man built his house on the rock. You see what we're saying about that? Yes, the wisdom is the actions and the activities. I'll probably do this in a totally different context, but when Kent and I'm guessing we're 6th grade, 7th grade. We originally lived 10 miles out of town, and Dad literally found a farm on the west end of town. And as long as we're 2 miles from football practice, we don't need a car. Because who needs a car if you can walk home for 2 miles? And so we literally bought the farm on the west side of town, and that way we didn't have to waste money on vehicles and I played the baritone saxophone in band, so I've gone to football practice and band practice with the baritone saxophone and my backpack and get through with practice and walk home for 2 miles because you don't need a car if you live that close to town. Well, Kent and I, we had a creek running through our farm, and we decided, wouldn't it be nice, we'll put a seine up here and we'll build this big sand little dam and have the wood, and then we'll have minnows and small perch and everything. And our dam is about this high down at the bottom of this creek, and we worked and worked and worked and worked and worked at just different times, and we got the right wire in there, and we got the little fish in there. And then one night we got a 4-inch rain. And the next day when we went back, you couldn't tell we'd ever been there. Everything just got completely washed down the North Fork Red River and headed toward the Gulf of Mexico. And I can't ever read the wise man built his house, the foolish man built his house upon the sand. But do you see in the figure of the wise and the foolish, and we will talk about the foolish more later, it is not only what they know, but it's their actions and their activity that determines if they're wise or foolish. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. Here is the expression, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Be wise as serpents, harmless as doves. And then when we look at the kingdom of heaven, the parables here in Matthew 25, then what is the difference between the 5 foolish and the 5 wives? Do you see what I'm saying again? It was their actions, it was their activity, and the wise were the ones who had brought the oil with them. And then here's this wonderful passage in Colossians 2, that their hearts may be encouraged, and I love this expression, knit together in love. Isn't that a wonderful description of a New Testament church? Not just strangers who are in the same building, people who are knit together in love. For years, there was a man, last name was McLaren, who was at OSU at the Bible chair, and we would go to 4-H roundup, and we got the bulletin from Stillwater at our home. And he'd been the campus minister for years and years, and he left. And his last article was entitled, The Wrenching of Roots. And he said, if you have a potted plant and you have 2 or 3 plants in it and they've grown together for years, you can't take one plant out without the wrenching of roots. And then he just talked about his appreciation and his love for the church and their sharing of life together. And this to me is always such a wonderful expression about the church. Oh, these are people, they're not just casual strangers. These are people who are knit together in love. And then notice, to reach all the riches of full assurance of understanding the knowledge of God's mystery, which is Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. And so here are descriptions of Jesus, both as a young man growing in wisdom, his teaching taught about wisdom, and then he again is the personification of wisdom in his personal life. And then I thought this passage from James, again, makes the same point. Who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. James 3:13. We're going to see this, and this will continue to be developed. And I don't know where this came into my mind, but years ago I came to this expression, especially our first 9 chapters of Proverbs. Wisdom is personified through the figures of 2 women. And we're going to have Lady Wisdom on this side, which we'll primarily be with tonight. But then whether she's called, some will call her Dame Folly or Lady Folly, the foolish woman, or on the other. And both of these women, this is a bad word, but let me say it. They're both evangelistic. They're soliciting. Both of these women are trying to encourage people to follow their different ways of life. And so when you notice this under number 1, both are in life's marketplace. They're in the center of the public activity of the ancient city. Both are calling out, and we saw this early. Lady Wisdom is at the city gates, and she is seeking to be heard. Both are soliciting for the attention of those who would listen to their voice. Both present a very different lifestyle of choices, and both are active in influencing the behavior of their life. Now, let me anticipate something with you because we're going to touch on this, but it's going to become more important later. The contrast between these first 9 chapters, which we're spending most of our time on in doing this, is that here's this instruction, particularly from a father, to my son, my son, my son. And again, I apologize this, but I hear Daniel's son when my son this and my son this, and if you watch the movie, you know what I'm saying, and you wax on and you whack off Daniel's son, and that comment. And so wisdom is both presented from the 2 women, but it's also a father's instruction to his son. And there's emphasis upon your father's instruction or teaching, and then your mother's instruction and teaching. And so we have a combination of the 2 voices personified, and they're both feminine. We're going to see she and her here in a little bit, very, very important in the discussion in the text. But we then also have a father giving instruction to his son. And so we're not going to read these, and that's why I wanted to give you these, but you can look at these. There's descriptions of wisdom in chapter 1, 2 through 7, 3, 5 through 6 we looked at last week. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he'll make your paths straight. And then chapter 3, 13 through 18, and 9, 1 through 3. But here's what I want you to notice. And I had a Bible several years ago that I left it at church and someone borrowed it and I haven't seen it. And so thank you. In this particular one, there are going to be quotation marks in several parts of Proverbs. Once we come to chapter 10, the quotations are the statements are primarily just one verse. But here are these lengthy descriptions, and we're going to have these descriptions, and there's going to be quotation marks around them. And so that's why when I put the word quotes, you can check your text. You'll notice in chapter 1, 22 through 32, quotation marks. Okay? Chapter 4, 4 through 9, quotation marks. Chapter 8, 4 through 36, quotation marks. Chapter 9, 4 through 6. So do you see what I'm trying to say? When you look at Lady Wisdom, then we have these speeches, these comments from her. And I'm going to do this in this particular text. I got out my yellow marker and I would just highlight the quotation marks. And rather than just being an individual verse, here's going to be this extended discussion. And so we're going to have the personification and the comments about who Lady Wisdom is. And then we get to listen to her voice. I don't know how discipline was administered in your house. In my house, my dad told us one time, and if we didn't do it, we got struck by lightning. It was immediate. It was just, he told us one time. Mom, on the other hand, would use Marshall Kent Hartman, and that's the first warning. And then nothing happened, and then the volume increased a little bit, and then the second one was Marshall Kent Hartman. And then when you heard the third time that all three of your given names were given, you're about to pass from grace to mercy. From grace to judgment. And that's just how Mom functioned. But when she called all three of your names, if nothing happened, if you made it to the third time, then that's what happened with Dad the first time. Well, with Lady Wisdom, she is going to be soliciting. And so when we have these quotations, then we're going to get to hear the voice of Lady Wisdom. And so kind of anticipate and read ahead and look at those. And notice again, this is why this first 9 chapters is this unit. And entire dissertations have been written by guys studying Hebrew in the Old Testament on the father-son relationship. But we have these extended quotations, and so anticipate and look for those. And then, if that's the case, guess what? The worldly woman, some translation, the loose woman, she is going to be crying out in the streets. And this is my least favorite, but we'll have one night where we'll just touch on these. And notice, chapter 2, 16 through 19, chapter 5, 3 through 14, chapter 6, 24 through 35, chapter 7, 5 through 13. And then as the book closes, we have 2 final appeals. Lady Wisdom's going to speak, and then the loose woman or the lady of the world is going to speak. And then you'll also see extended quotations who are given by her. So in chapters 3 and 4, I'd like to read some of these admonitions to seek and to find wisdom. And for those who are listening to us, if you turn to Proverbs chapter 3, we're going to read verses initially 4 through 7. And we touched on this last week. And if you weren't here last week, my aunt, my dad's younger sister, 20 years before she died, put Proverbs 3 and verses, I think it was 4 and 5, or 5 and 6, I don't remember, but trust in the Lord with all of your heart. In all your ways acknowledge Him. And so on the front, here were their names, their birth dates. They came back and filled in the death date. On the back were the sons and the grandsons, but at the very bottom, 20 years before she died, she wanted her family to remember, trust in the Lord with all your heart. So that's the section from chapter 3, verses 4 through 7. Then the next one, and you'll have to turn the page to do both of these, but this will also be in chapter 3, verses 13 through 18. And again, listen to the voice of wisdom. Blessed is the one who finds wisdom. And let me go ahead and go down to verse 18, just for emphasis. Those who hold her fast are called blessed. And again, here's one of these parentheses, one of these inclusios. And in this section, and you could use the word happy, you could use the word fulfilled, you could use the word, it's an appropriate word for a right relationship with God. So I'm going back to chapter 3, verse 13. Blessed is the one who finds wisdom. And remember, the second line is always going to interact with the first. And the one who gets understanding. For the gain, and notice the gender, the gain from her is better than gain from silver, her profit better than gold. She is more precious than jewels. Nothing you desire can compare with her. Long life is in her right hand, and in her left hand are riches and honor. And then on the next page, her ways are ways of pleasantness, and all her paths are peace. And isn't this interesting? In the middle of the Old Testament, we have a reference to what? The tree of life. That which physically mankind was excluded from because of sin in the Garden of Eden. And this personification of wisdom says, she, Lady Wisdom, is a tree of life to those who lay hold of her, and those who hold her fast are called blessed. Now, this is a term that we use a lot of times. We hear echoes of things in the Old Testament that we hear in the New Testament. Where do we hear blessed are? Poor in spirit. Blessed are the meek. You see what I'm saying? And so here's this passage, and it's feminine in that, again, Lady Wisdom is personified as a female character throughout Proverbs. And appropriately, as the father speaks to his son, then the admonition is, rather than the loose woman, both in terms of lifestyle and choices, then the father's going to admonish the son to listen to the voice of Lady Wisdom, and she, again, will be constantly personified in a feminine gender, but blessed, happy. And remember the very first night, this was a statement I read in Walter Kaiser, and I don't know, maybe 40 years ago, but it's always stuck with me. The wisdom literature commends in poetical form what the law commands. And so what Moses may have commanded in Exodus, Leviticus, or something, then here in poetical form, do you want to live a happy life? Do you want to be blessed? Do you want God to be able to care for you and look after you? And so Lady Wisdom is going to be personified as saying, okay, listen to me, and here is how you live a blessed life. This is one of my very favorite ones, and this is just briefly touched on in chapter 3, verses 19 through 20, and then anticipate chapter 8 of Proverbs is the nearest thing to John chapter 1 that we have in the Old Testament. And Lady Wisdom is going to say, I was daily with him, I was his delight. I was with him like a master workman. And in the creation of the world, Genesis 1 through 3, then wisdom is going to say, and I was with God when that happened. And then what do we hear in John 1? Oh, the Word became flesh, dwelt among us. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. All things were made either through him or by him. Without him was not anything made that was made. And we're going to hear a fuller echo of this in chapter 8. But notice Proverbs 3, 19 through 20. The Lord by wisdom founded the earth. By understanding he established the heavens. By his knowledge the deeps broke open, and the clouds dropped down the dew. I'm sorry I've forgotten. Does anybody remember how often Halley's Comet is visible? 76 years? Because we were living in Australia, our home was in Campbelltown, and when it was coming through, this would be sometime in the 80s, then I got out one night, and in their backyard, there was a place that you blocked off a lot of light, and I just waited and waited, and then finally just faintly could kind of see that, and I thought, well, I probably won't be here for the next one. So while I'm still here, and then you stop and think, and how far does this thing go? And it just makes this amazing trek throughout the universe and then comes back. And then I read these passages and I think, oh yes, by wisdom, God spoke this into existence. Absolutely amazing. And then here's chapter 3, 21 through 24. Wisdom is the doorway into the life that God intends. My son, do not lose sight of these. Keep sound wisdom and discretion. They will be life for your soul, adornment for your neck. If you walk in your way securely and your feet do not stumble, if you lie down, you will not be afraid, and when you lie down, your sleep will be sweet. So we're going to do one more sample and then just talk about some applications of these. And this happened earlier, but I chose, if you have the outline in chapter 4 through 9, to just underline the feminine characteristics of the description of wisdom. That's what I say. Here is the personification, and here is the actions of Lady Wisdom. Again, taught within the context of a father to his son and mother's instruction. But listen to this. The son says about his father, he taught me and said, and notice quotation marks. So in this case, these are going to be a quotation from the Son reflecting upon his Father's teaching. Let your heart hold fast my words, keep my commandments and live, get wisdom, get insight, do not forget and do not turn away from the words of my mouth. Do not forsake her, and she will keep you. Love her, and she will guard you. The beginning of wisdom is this: get wisdom, and whatever you get insight. Prize her highly, and she will exalt you. She will honor you if you embrace her. She will place on your head a graceful garland, and she will bestow on you a beautiful crown. Quotation marks. So again, as you read through this first section in the future, look at that and listen to these admonitions either from Lady Wisdom, or this time is the discussion about this. Here's just some things, and we'll summarize these, and these will go very quickly. But again, just remember, Jesus grew in wisdom, and hopefully so should and can we. And let me say it this way. Until I was 22, I had I had one great and grandparents. So we just grew up with older people, and I did funerals at 101 and 199 and 98, 97, 93, and the young ones died at 89. So the first 2 decades of my life, I'm surrounded by decades of wisdom. Grandmother, son, some girls have the looks of a model and the maternal instinct of a mannequin. Son, do more than just marry a pretty skirt. And so you just grow up with these things, and these were people who survived the Dust Bowl, ran a country store, and Grandma would say, son, it's hard to starve out people who can grow a 2-acre garden. And we just grew up with these people and it was their life and their actions. Well, I think of that same process when I listen to wisdom in the book of Proverbs, and then I think, oh, Jesus grew in wisdom. And as we walk in his steps, hopefully we can do the same. Some reflections. A wise person, this is 2:1. A wise person takes a God-centered focus on our lives and the fear of the Lord, and we'll come back and talk about that, but that refrain is all the way through. And in Proverbs, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. It's rephrased over and over. It will be in Psalms, I think it's 111 and 10, the fear of the Lord. Fear of the Lord in Job 28:28. And then what does Ecclesiastes say? Here's the end of the whole matter. Fear God, keep his commandments. And so that's a thread we'll come back to. But wisdom starts with having a God-centered life. The wise are those who know what is appropriate. They know how to say the right word at the right time. Proverbs 15:23. A word spoken in due season, how good it is. The wise are not people who are isolated. They value the importance of interaction with others. And again, we've had this wisdom crying out. One of my favorite proverbs that we talked with our children growing up, and I mentioned this when our kids were going from junior high on. I was the taxi service, and we usually sang 1 or 2 songs. We had something to be thankful for, and then we did different proverbs that we talked about, and one of those proverbs was, iron sharpens iron, and what? One man sharpens another. Watch your friends while you're at school, because in one way or another, one man will sharpen another. Interaction. But wisdom also has to do with our routine affairs. And we'll see Lady Wisdom personified as Sheila talks about this hypothetical woman who could never have done all these things in Proverbs 31. But you look at the instruction that's there. She works with her hands. She clothes her household. She looks well to the ways of her household. The terms understanding and discernment. There's a time to speak and there's a time to be silent. And if you're like me, we've repented sometimes. I should not have said that. Lord, I will try to do better. And then a few times I've left and I said, something really should have been said. And there again is wisdom trying to discern which of those two is appropriate. And then there's a sense of a balanced life. You know, a person's greatest strength can be his or her greatest weakness. And trying to have this balanced life that, and I love this expression, and this is something Dave Bland had said, a wise person works but is not a workaholic. He and she sleeps but is not slothful. And he learns the importance of being timely. Word fitly spoken, apples of gold and settings of silver. So here's our final thoughts, and these again will go quickly. And, you know, for those of you who have hired, especially younger people, there's never a time where generations have any more conflict when a younger person works for an older person in terms of generational expectations. And the number one reason people are released from employment is not skill, but it oftentimes has to do with relationship problems or the inability to get along with people in the workplace. And when you deal with people like this, it was always someone else's fault. And those of you who hired know exactly what I'm talking about, and you've seen that. Parents and teenage children go through seasons of strained relationships. Wisdom, and this is true for us as grandparents, is trying to say the appropriate thing and have the appropriate response to life situations. Lord, when we'll talk about this in February, one of my choices is that as much as possible, every time my kids do something good, I want to focus on that and minimize what we have to do when they do things that aren't good. Boundaries and consequences. But you stop and think about it, and we've all had people like this. There are some people who only notice their kids when they do something bad, and you reinforce that behavior if that's the only time that you do that. There's wisdom. Teachers and students. Wisdom is to have the best relationship under the circumstances. And we'll talk about this with the loose moment, and it's not just teenagers. This is all the way through life. A society saturated with sexual temptation. The challenge and benefit of having spiritually minded friends. And the dangers that exist in deep relationships with ungodly friends. Boy, this is really true. And I'll just do this quickly. My grandfather was an elder, I don't know, probably 30 years. And in the last months of his life, we had to put him in a care facility. And bless his heart, the guy who was in the room with him just swore profusely, just nonstop. And you can't get out of bed, you can't move, and you're a godly person. So if you can't move, what do you do if the guy next to you is swearing profusely? You pray louder than he's swearing. And that way, if you're praying louder than he's swearing, then you don't have to listen to the profanity. And so my aunt went by and then went and got the head nurse, and she said, someone has to move. My dad shouldn't have to sit here all day and pray louder than this guy is swearing, but he's not just going to lay here in bed and listen to this. And even at that age in life, our relationships and our friendships are really, really important. Relationships, again, work environment, our neighborhood, and then wisdom is detected by what comes out of our mouth. What does our speech or how we say it say about what's in our hearts? And again, we're going to look one night just about the term fool, and again, anticipate the fool is less one of ignorance. And one of the expressions that I like is that a fool is a person who's not teachable. A lot of times a fool will know better but will still do that, and a fool will continue in a behavior that's either not good for him or appropriate. And again, timing is so important. Learning to try to say and do the right thing at the right time. And we started with this tonight. The tone of our voice is a very crucial part of that. My dad was the head adjuster for Oklahoma Farm Bureau for wheat. And so if Brother Lewis has a wheat field and it gets hailed on, then we go that. And we were in people's yards and farms all the time. And when you go to a strange house and the dog comes out, my dad would say, you watch his ears and you watch his tail. And you talk to him, but he will already know if you're afraid before you say something. Son, you can't fool dogs, and you can't fool little kids. And if you can't get to the door, then try to get to the pickup before he gets you. And here's this sense of discretion and learning, but the tone, and you know what I'm saying with little kids. And let me just say it this way. We can't fool our kids. They see us at our best. They see us when we're struggling. And as we're older, and hopefully as grandparents, we become even more concerned about the tone that we use. My grandfather on my dad's side, again, was the elder of the church. And when both of them died, I said, in our family, we had salt and pepper at the table. And we grew up with salt and pepper in our grandparents. And you can kind of figure out which one's which. But through the years, I was talking with my aunt, my dad's sister, and she said, I never heard my dad say an unkind word either to or about my mother. He hummed a lot sometimes, but he never said an unkind word either to or about my mother. And that was the same with us. We were always treated with such a sense of respect. We were called sir. You know, here's a man who's in his 70s and we're, little boys. And he refers to us as yes, sir, and no, sir. And we were always treated with this dignity and respect. And the tone of how we were treated, he's still the spiritual leader of our families, and he died in 1993 because of how he spoke to us and how he dealt with us. That's an important part of wisdom. Here's our last statement, and thank you for being here. Wisdom begins and ends with a respect and acknowledgement of God's character. The fear of the Lord begins with and I use it, the vertical relationship with the Almighty, but it is expressed in my horizontal relationships in the world. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom instruction. And I'd like for us, as we continue to listen to and be instructed by the voice of Lady Wisdom in our day-to-day life. God bless. Thank you.